The crimson droplets stained the hem of her dress as Delilah Prescott clutched her swollen belly, the pain pulsing through her body in unforgiving waves. Thunder cracked overhead, a violent echo of the rage she'd fled just hours before. Rain was beginning to fall, washing away her footprints on the muddy path leading away from the place she once called home, but couldn't wash away the terror that still gripped her heart. Virginia City, Nevada, 1875. The mining town that had once promised a new beginning now seemed like a prison as Delilah stumbled through the darkening streets. 3 months pregnant and bleeding, the consequence of Benjamin's drunken fury when she'd revealed her condition. Her husband's hands, once gentle in courtship, had turned to weapons against her. "You ain't keeping it," he had snarled, his whiskey breath hot against her face. "No child of mine gonna slow me down." His boot had connected with her side before she could protect herself, sending her crashing against the rough wooden table. The pain had been immediate and horrifying. When he turned to fetch his pistol, threatening worse, she'd fled into the gathering storm. Now, as thunder rolled across the Nevada sky, Delilah knew she needed help for herself and for the child she desperately wanted to save. The saloon lights glimmered ahead, her only hope in the growing darkness. She prayed someone might help, though in her experience, men were more likely to return her to her husband than offer sanctuary. The rain intensified, plastering her chestnut hair against her pale face. Her fingers slipped on the saloon door, leaving a smear of crimson against the weathered wood as she pushed it open. The raucous noise within faltered as heads turned toward the battered woman in the doorway. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please." Then darkness claimed her. Frank Archer had seen his fair share of hardship in his 30 years. The war between the states had taken his youth, and 5 years driving cattle across the unforgiving West had hardened him into the man he'd become. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of the pregnant woman collapsing in the doorway of the Silver Dollar Saloon. He moved before thinking, pushing back his chair and crossing the room in long strides. The woman lay crumpled on the threshold, rain and blood mingling beneath her. Even in unconsciousness, her arms remained protectively wrapped around her belly. "Stand back," he commanded, his deep voice cutting through the shocked silence. "She needs air." Frank knelt beside her, gently turning her face. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features marred by a purpling bruise across her cheekbone. Her lips were bloodless, her skin ashen beneath the dirt and rain. "Someone get Doc Sullivan," he ordered, sliding his arms beneath her slight frame. The bartender nodded, dispatching a young boy into the storm. "Might be Benjamin Prescott's wife," muttered a grizzled miner. "Saw him dragging her down the street last week, cussing up a storm." Frank's jaw tightened. He knew Prescott by reputation, a mean drunk with quick fists and a quicker temper. The woman moaned softly as he lifted her, her eyelids fluttering to reveal frightened hazel eyes. "Don't take me back," she whispered. "Please, he'll kill my baby." "You're safe, madam," Frank assured her, his voice gentle despite the rage building inside him. "I'm taking you to the doctor." Rain lashed against them as he carried her from the saloon. The town's doctor lived just 2 buildings down, but even that short distance would soak them to the skin. Frank pulled her closer, using his body to shield her from the worst of the downpour. Doc Sullivan was already pulling on his spectacles when Frank kicked at his door. The elderly physician took one look at the bleeding woman and motioned toward the examination table in his back room. "Carefully now," he instructed as Frank laid her down. "What happened?" "Found her collapsed at the saloon. Seems her husband's been using her as a punching bag." The doctor's lips thinned as he gently examined his patient. "Mrs. Prescott, isn't it? Delilah." She nodded weakly, her frightened eyes darting between the two men. "I need to examine you properly, my dear," the doctor said. "Mr. Archer, if you would wait outside." Frank nodded, stepping into the front room but leaving the door ajar. He paced like a caged animal, his mind racing. He'd seen men like Prescott before, men who took their frustrations out on those weaker than themselves. It sickened him. Through the partially open door, he heard the doctor's gentle questioning and the woman's soft, tear-filled responses. 3 months with child, bleeding since the afternoon. Pain in her abdomen, her husband's boots connecting with her side. Frank's hands curled into fists. Outside, the storm raged on, matching his internal fury. After what seemed an eternity, the doctor emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She's stabilized for now," he said quietly. "The bleeding has slowed. It's a miracle she hasn't lost the child, but she's young and strong." "Will she recover?" Frank asked. "With proper rest and care, yes, but she can't go back to that house. Not if she wants to keep this baby." Frank nodded grimly. "And Prescott?" "The law in this town has a blind eye where Benjamin Prescott is concerned. His father owns half the claims in the area." The doctor sighed. "She needs somewhere safe, at least until she can travel to her family in Sacramento." "She has family, a sister," she says. "But she can't make that journey yet, not in her condition. She needs at least a few weeks of rest." Frank removed his hat, running fingers through his dark hair. "My ranch is about 10 miles outside town. She'd be safe there until she's strong enough to travel." The doctor studied him carefully. "You're a good man, Archer, but people will talk. Let them. I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds. She'll act as chaperone and help care for Mrs. Prescott." A soft voice interrupted them. "I can't impose." Delilah stood in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. She had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but couldn't hide the tremble in her limbs. "Madam," Frank said, stepping forward, "you need time to heal. My ranch is remote enough that your husband won't find you and comfortable enough for you to recover." Fear flickered across her face. "You don't understand. Benjamin won't stop looking. When he drinks, She swallowed hard. "He becomes someone else." "I understand better than you might think," Frank said quietly. "And I promise you, Mrs. Prescott, no harm will come to you or your child on my watch." Delilah studied the tall cowboy, his steady gaze, the quiet confidence in his stance. There was something in those blue eyes that spoke of integrity, of strength without cruelty. It had been so long since she'd seen kindness in a man's eyes that she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Frank's expression softened slightly. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because no woman should live in fear, especially not one carrying a child." Outside, the thunder rumbled closer now. The doctor glanced toward the window. "This storm's getting worse," he observed. "If you're going to make it to your ranch tonight, you should leave soon." Delilah's hands protectively cradled her belly. 3 months she'd carried this child, already loving it fiercely. If staying with this stranger meant giving her baby a chance at life, what choice did she have? "I'll go," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Archer." Frank nodded, a silent promise passing between them. "We'll need to leave now before the roads become impassable. And before your husband realizes you've gone." The doctor handed her a small packet. "Herbs for tea, they'll help with the pain and strengthen the womb. Rest as much as possible. No lifting, no exertion." Delilah tucked the packet into her pocket, grimacing as she straightened. "I have nothing with me." "No clothes, no, we'll manage," Frank interrupted. "Mrs. Reynolds is about your size. She can lend you what you need until we figure something else out." The doctor helped her into a heavy coat, his late wife's. He explained while Frank peered out the window, scanning the rain-slicked street. No sign of Benjamin Prescott yet, but it wouldn't be long before he started searching. Men like him didn't like losing what they considered their property. "My horse is behind the saloon," Frank said. "We'll take the back streets out of town." Delilah nodded, gathering her strength. Each step sent pain radiating through her abdomen, but she bit her lip, determined not to show weakness. The doctor clasped her hand before they left. "God be with you, Mrs. Prescott," he said softly. Then, to Frank, "Take care of her, Archer." Frank's expression was solemn. "With my life, Doc." The rain had intensified, drumming against the boardwalks and streaming in rivulets down the muddy street. Frank helped Delilah navigate the slippery path behind the buildings, supporting her with a strong arm around her waist. Every few steps, she would pause, catching her breath against the pain. They reached the hitching post where Frank's horse waited, a large bay gelding that snorted impatiently in the downpour. Frank quickly checked the saddle, then turned to Delilah. "I'll help you up, then mount behind you," he explained. "It'll be easier to support you that way." She nodded, allowing him to lift her onto the saddle. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her, drawing a soft cry from her lips. "I'm sorry," Frank murmured, swinging up behind her. "Just a little longer and you can rest properly." The warmth of his chest against her back was both strange and comforting. Delilah couldn't remember the last time a man had touched her without causing pain. Frank's arms encircled her as he took up the reins, creating a protective barrier that made her want to weep with relief. They set off at a careful walk, Frank keeping the horse steady despite the increasingly treacherous conditions. Rain lashed at them mercilessly, and lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes that illuminated the rugged landscape. Each crash of thunder made Delilah flinch. "Storm's moving east," Frank observed, his breath warm against her ear. "We're heading southwest. Should ride out of the worst of it soon." Delilah nodded, too focused on the pain and the effort of staying upright to respond. Her damp skirts clung to her legs, and despite the coat, she was shivering uncontrollably. They had just crested a small rise when Frank suddenly reined in the horse. "Riders," he said tersely. "Coming from town." Through the curtain of rain, Delilah could make out 3 mounted figures moving rapidly along the main road. "Benjamin," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "That's Benjamin in front. I recognize the way he sits a horse." Frank quickly guided his mount into a stand of cottonwoods. "They haven't seen us yet. We'll wait until they pass." Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs as the riders drew closer. Benjamin's voice carried through the storm, slurred with drink and rage. "She can't have gone far, bleeding like that," another voice placating. "We'll find her, Ben." "Probably just hiding at a neighbor's. When I get my hands on her." The rest was lost in the wind, but Delilah didn't need to hear it. She knew exactly what her husband would do if he caught her. Frank's arm tightened around her waist, a silent reassurance. They remained motionless until the riders had passed, continuing eastward toward the outlying homesteads. "They're looking in the wrong direction," Frank said once they were out of earshot. "But we need to keep moving. Can you hold on a little longer?" Delilah nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. "I have to." They continued their careful journey, leaving the main trail to follow a less obvious path that wound through scrubby hills. The rain began to ease somewhat, though lightning still illuminated the clouds in the distance. "Not much further now," Frank assured her after they'd been riding for nearly an hour. Delilah had fallen silent, concentrating all her energy on staying conscious. The bleeding had slowed to a worrying seep, but the pain remained, sharp and insistent. When the ranch house finally came into view, it was like a beacon in the darkness. Lamplight glowed warmly from the windows, and smoke curled from the stone chimney despite the late hour. It was larger than Delilah had expected, a substantial 2-story structure with a wide porch and several outbuildings nearby, As they approached, the front door opened, and a stout, gray-haired woman emerged, lantern in hand. "Mr. Archer," she called. "I was getting worried with this storm." "Mrs. Reynolds," Frank replied, guiding the horse to the hitching post. "We have a guest who needs urgent care." The woman hurried forward, her expression changing to one of concern as she took in Delilah's condition. "Good heavens, bring her in quickly." Frank dismounted first, then carefully helped Delilah down. Her legs buckled as her feet touched the ground, and he caught her, lifting her once more into his arms. The movement sent a fresh spasm of pain through her, and she couldn't suppress a whimper. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe now." Mrs. Reynolds led the way, holding the door wide as Frank carried Delilah into the warm house. The contrast between the chilly night air and the heated interior made Delilah's head swim. "The blue bedroom," Mrs. Reynolds directed. "I'll fetch hot water and towels." Frank carried Delilah up a flight of stairs and into a spacious bedroom. A fire already burned in the small hearth, and the turned-down bed looked impossibly inviting after the harrowing journey. He set her gently on the edge of the bed. "Mrs. Reynolds will help you get dry and comfortable. I'll wait outside if you need anything." Delilah caught his sleeve as he turned to go. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't think about that now," he interrupted gently. "Just rest. You're safe here." The housekeeper returned with steaming water, towels, and a nightgown. She shooed Frank from the room, then helped Delilah out of her sodden clothes. The older woman's hands were gentle but efficient as she bathed away the dirt and blood, exclaiming softly at the bruises that marked Delilah's pale skin. "Poor lamb," she murmured. "What kind of monster does such things?" Delilah didn't answer. The warmth and kindness were overwhelming after so many months of fear. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as Mrs. Reynolds helped her into the nightgown and guided her to lie down. "The doctor gave me herbs," Delilah remembered, gesturing weakly toward the discarded coat. Mrs. Reynolds found the packet and nodded. "I'll make this into a tea. Try to rest now." Left alone, Delilah sank into the soft mattress, her hand resting protectively over her belly. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that she and her baby might survive. The thought brought fresh tears, but also a fragile hope. When Mrs. Reynolds returned with the tea, Frank accompanied her, carrying extra blankets. He remained in the doorway, a respectful distance away, while the housekeeper helped Delilah sit up enough to drink. "The storm's getting worse," he said, "but you're safe here. I've got men watching the approaches to the ranch just in case." Delilah's hands trembled around the teacup. "You don't know Benjamin. He won't stop looking." "Perhaps not," Frank agreed. "But he won't find you, and he can't stay away from the saloon long enough to search properly." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I've known men like your husband, Mrs. Prescott. They're dangerous but predictable." Mrs. Reynolds took the empty cup. "You need sleep, dear. The herbs will help with the pain and protect the baby." Delilah wanted to thank them again, to express the gratitude that swelled in her chest, but exhaustion was pulling her under. Her eyelids grew heavy as the herbal concoction began to work. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Frank's tall figure by the door, his eyes watchful and his expression resolute. For the first time since her marriage to Benjamin, Delilah Prescott fell asleep without fear. Frank watched from the doorway as Mrs. Reynolds tucked the blankets around the sleeping woman. Something about Delilah Prescott had awakened a fierce protectiveness in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since losing his sister during the war. "She's been badly treated, Mr. Archer," Mrs. Reynolds said quietly as they stepped into the hallway. "Those bruises, and in her condition." "I know." Frank's jaw tightened. "Her husband's a coward who beats women. If there was any justice, he'd be the one bleeding in the dirt." Justice comes in its own time, the housekeeper replied. For now, she needs rest and safety. I'll sit with her tonight. Frank shook his head. Get some sleep, Mrs. Reynolds. I'll take the first watch. You can relieve me before dawn. The older woman studied him with knowing eyes. Very well. But remember, Mr. Archer, that young woman has seen the worst of men. Don't give her cause to fear you too. I would never, he began, then stopped, understanding her meaning. I'll be respectful, Mrs. Reynolds. You have my word. After the housekeeper retired to her room, Frank settled into a chair outside Delilah's door. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling around the eaves of the ranch house. Occasionally, he would rise to check on their guest, opening the door just enough to ensure she was sleeping peacefully. During one such check, he found her thrashing against the sheets, her face contorted in a silent nightmare. Without thinking, he moved to her side, gently catching her flailing hands. "Mrs. Prescott," he called softly. "Delilah, you're safe. It's just a dream." Her eyes flew open, wild with terror until recognition dawned. "Mr. Archer," she gasped. "I thought I was back there and you're at my ranch," he reminded her, releasing her hands once she had calmed. "Benjamin can't hurt you here." She pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the movement. "I'm sorry for the trouble, for all of this." Frank shook his head. "There's no trouble. I'm just glad I was at the saloon when you needed help." Delilah's hand moved to her abdomen. "The baby, is it?" The doctor seemed hopeful, and the bleeding has slowed considerably. Frank cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the impropriety of discussing such matters. "Mrs. Reynolds will check on you in the morning." Delilah nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where lightning periodically illuminated the rain-lashed glass. "I always loved storms," she said softly. "Before Benjamin, they made me feel alive." Frank followed her gaze. "My mother used to say storms were just the sky clearing out its troubles, making room for better days ahead." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I like that thought." They fell silent for a moment, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the rain against the glass. Frank knew he should return to his post outside her door, but something held him there, perhaps the lingering fear in her eyes, or the way her slender shoulders seemed to bear an invisible weight. "How did you meet him?" he asked finally. "If you don't mind my asking." Delilah's fingers twisted in the blanket. "I was working as a teacher in Sacramento. Benjamin came from Virginia City to visit his cousin, my landlord. He was different then, charming, attentive." Her voice grew distant. "He courted me for 3 months, promising me the world. Said he owned silver mines, that I'd want for nothing as his wife. And after the wedding, we traveled here to Virginia City. That's when I discovered there were no silver mines, just a small claim that barely produced enough to keep us in food." The charming man disappeared, replaced by someone darker. Her voice faltered. "The first time he hit me was a month after we arrived. He'd been drinking with friends, lost money at cards. He said it was my fault for being too extravagant with the household money." Frank's hands tightened on the bedpost. "No man has the right to raise his hand to a woman. Not ever." Delilah's eyes met his, measuring the conviction in his words. "My father felt differently. He believed a husband's authority was absolute. Perhaps that's why I didn't leave at the first blow. I thought it was normal, expected even." "It's not," Frank said firmly, "and it never will be, not while I draw breath." Her expression softened slightly. "You're a rare kind of man, Mr. Archer." "Frank," he corrected. "If you're going to be staying here, you might as well use my given name." "Frank," she repeated, the name sounding almost foreign on her lips after months of formality with her husband. "And I'm Delilah. Though I suppose you already knew that." He nodded, then straightened. "You should try to sleep again. The herbs will work better if you rest." Delilah settled back against the pillows, her eyelids already growing heavy. "Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep. I don't want to dream of him again." The request was delivered with such vulnerability that Frank couldn't refuse. He moved the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "I'll be right here. No more nightmares tonight." She gave him a grateful smile, then closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, the worry lines in her forehead smoothing out. Frank watched her for a long time, struck by the quiet courage she had shown. To flee in her condition, bleeding and alone into a storm, took a kind of bravery he respected deeply. His gaze lingered on her face, peaceful now in sleep, and he silently renewed his vow to protect her from Benjamin Prescott, from the judgments of Virginia City, and from any other harm that might come her way. Outside, the storm began to subside, the spaces between lightning and thunder growing longer. By the time Mrs. Reynolds came to relieve him before dawn, the rain had softened to a gentle patter against the roof, and Delilah was sleeping soundly, one hand still curved protectively over her unborn child. The next few days established a quiet routine at the ranch. Delilah remained in bed as the doctor had instructed, her strength returning slowly. The bleeding stopped entirely by the third day, much to everyone's relief. Mrs. Reynolds fussed over her, bringing nourishing broths and fresh baked bread, insisting she eat to strengthen both herself and the baby. Frank kept his distance, respecting her privacy while she recovered. He would inquire after her health during meals, which he took with Mrs. Reynolds in the kitchen, but otherwise focused on the daily operations of his ranch. The spring cattle drive was approaching, and there was much to prepare. On the fourth morning, Delilah awoke feeling stronger than she had in weeks. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating a room she had barely had the energy to notice before. It was simply but tastefully furnished, with faded blue curtains that matched the quilt, a pine dresser with a mirror above it, and a small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. She rose carefully, testing her legs. The sharp pain had subsided to a dull ache, manageable if she moved slowly. Mrs. Reynolds had provided a simple dress and undergarments that fit tolerably well, if a bit loose through the shoulders. Delilah dressed herself, then approached the window. The view took her breath away. The ranch sprawled below her, nestled in a shallow valley surrounded by rolling hills. A small creek wound through pastureland where cattle grazed in the distance. Closer to the house, a kitchen garden burst with early spring vegetables, and a corral held several horses. Beyond it all, mountains rose blue against the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Delilah turned to find Mrs. Reynolds in the doorway with a breakfast tray. "It's paradise," she admitted. "I never imagined anywhere so peaceful existed near Virginia City." The housekeeper set the tray on a small table by the window. "Mr. Archer chose this land carefully, says it reminds him of Kentucky where he grew up." She gestured to the chair. "Sit and eat, dear. You're looking better today." Delilah obeyed, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. The tray held scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits with butter and honey, and a cup of herbal tea made from the doctor's prescription. "Mr. Archer Frank has been very kind," she said between bites. "As have you. I don't know how I'll ever repay such generosity." Mrs. Reynolds waved away her thanks. "That man has more goodness in him than most, though he'd never admit it. Lost his family young parents to fever sister during the war, been on his own a long time." She straightened the already neat bed covers. "He understands what it means to need help." Delilah considered this new information. "He mentioned Kentucky. How did he come to Nevada?" "After the war he fought for the Union. Though his home state was divided, he couldn't face going back. Too many memories," he said. Drove cattle in Texas for a while, then up through Colorado. Won this land in a poker game 5 years ago from a man too drunk to know what he was wagering. He seems too honorable for gambling, Delilah observed. Mrs. Reynolds chuckled. Oh, he is now. Says that game was his last, a sign from Providence that he should settle down and build something lasting. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the open door. Frank stood there, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable. Mrs. Prescott, he greeted her. Good to see you up and about. Please call me Delilah, she reminded him. And yes, I'm feeling much stronger today. Glad to hear it. He shifted his weight, clearly unused to sickroom visits. I'm heading into town for supplies. I wondered if there was anything specific you needed. Delilah thought of her few possessions, left behind in Benjamin's house. Clothing, her mother's locket, the small collection of books she'd brought from Sacramento. But asking for them meant risking discovery. Nothing urgent, she said finally, though perhaps some sewing supplies. If I'm to stay here a while, I should earn my keep somehow. Frank's expression softened. You're not a hired hand, Delilah, you're a guest. Even guests can contribute, she insisted. I was raised to believe idle hands invite discontent. He nodded, respecting her desire for purpose. Sewing supplies it is, and perhaps some fabric. Mrs. Reynolds mentioned you might need clothing more suited to your condition. Delilah felt her cheeks warm. That's very thoughtful. Mrs. Reynolds interjected practically. Blue or green would suit her coloring, and nothing too heavy. Summer's approaching fast. Frank looked relieved to have such specific instructions. I'll see what they have at Williamson's Mercantile. After he departed, Mrs. Reynolds helped Delilah downstairs to the porch, where a comfortable chair had been placed in the shade. The housekeeper provided a light shawl, though the spring air was mild, and a glass of cool water from the well. Rest here, she instructed. Fresh air will do you good, but don't overtax yourself. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything. Left alone, Delilah breathed deeply, savoring the scents of pine and sage carried on the gentle breeze. In the distance, ranch hands moved among the cattle, their occasional calls floating back to her on the wind. A pair of horses played in the corral, chasing each other in circles before stopping to graze side by side. The peaceful scene was so unlike her life with Benjamin that it felt almost unreal. For months, she had existed in a state of constant vigilance, anticipating his moods, trying to avoid triggers for his temper. Now, surrounded by this tranquility, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where her child would grow up without fear, where she might find happiness again. But such dreams were dangerous. Benjamin wouldn't simply let her go, and even if he did, what then? A woman alone with a child had few options, especially one whose reputation would be tarnished by separation from her husband. These troubling thoughts occupied her until mid-afternoon, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats roused her from her reverie. For one terrifying moment, she feared Benjamin had found her. She half rose from the chair, heart pounding, before recognizing Frank's bay gelding trotting up the path. He dismounted smoothly, handed the reins to a waiting ranch hand, and approached the porch with several packages under his arm. His smile was warm as he climbed the steps. "Beautiful day," he remarked. "How are you feeling?" "Better for the fresh air," Delilah replied, settling back into her chair. "Did you have any trouble in town?" Frank set the packages on a small table. "None at all." Prescott was at the saloon, deep in his cups despite the early hour. "Seems he's convinced you've run off to Sacramento." He hesitated, then added, "I heard him tell the barkeep he was well rid of you and the brat." Relief and hurt mingled in Delilah's chest. If Benjamin truly believed she'd gone to Sacramento, perhaps he wouldn't search for her here. Yet his callous dismissal of both her and their child stung, despite everything. "Then I'm safe for now," she said, trying to focus on the practical implications. Frank studied her face. "You are. But eventually decisions will need to be made. About your future, about the child. I know." Delilah's hand moved to her abdomen where a small but definite swell had formed. "My sister would take us in, I'm sure, but I can't travel in this condition and once the baby comes." She sighed. A woman alone with a newborn would find the journey challenging, to say the least. Frank seemed to wrestle with something before speaking. "You could stay here. Until the baby's born, at least. The ranch is isolated enough that few would know, and those who work for me are loyal." The offer stunned her. "I couldn't impose for so long. It must be 5 months or more before the baby comes." "It's no imposition. The house is large and Mrs. Reynolds would welcome the company." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I'll be gone for much of the summer with the cattle drive." "You'd be doing me a favor, giving Mrs. Reynolds someone to fuss over in my absence." Delilah searched his face, looking for ulterior motives and finding none. Just kindness in those blue eyes and perhaps something else, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "Why are you doing this, Frank?" she asked softly. "Truly," he looked away toward the distant mountains. "I told you about my sister. Mrs. Reynolds mentioned she died during the war." Frank nodded. "Catherine was 18, newly married when the fighting reached our town. Her husband was away with the army, and she was expecting their first child." His voice tightened. "Raiders came, not regular soldiers, just opportunists using the war as an excuse for violence. I was miles away, unable to help. By the time I returned, she was gone." Delilah's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't save her," he continued, "but maybe I can help you. Consider it atonement if you will." "There's nothing to atone for," Delilah said gently. "You couldn't have known what would happen to your sister." Frank met her gaze again. "Perhaps not. But the offer stands, regardless of my reasons. Stay, Delilah, at least until the baby comes and you're strong enough to travel safely." In that moment, looking into his earnest face, Delilah made her decision. "Thank you. I accept your generous offer." Relief flickered across his features. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat, gesturing to the packages. "I brought the sewing things you requested and some fabric. Mrs. Reynolds can help you with measurements if needed." Delilah reached for the parcels, her fingers brushing his as she took them. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she quickly withdrew her hand. "Thank you," she said again, focusing on unwrapping the paper. Inside, she found a selection of beautiful fabrics, soft cotton in blue and green, just as Mrs. Reynolds had suggested, along with thread, buttons, and other notions. "These are lovely," she murmured. "Far finer than I expected." Frank looked pleased. "Williamson got in a new shipment last week. Said these were the latest styles from San Francisco." The thought he had put into the selections touched her deeply. "You've been more than kind, Frank. I don't know if I can ever adequately express my gratitude." "No need," he said simply. "Just focus on keeping yourself and the little one healthy." As the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Mrs. Reynolds called them in for supper. Frank helped Delilah to her feet, his hand steady beneath her elbow as they walked inside. The simple meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread was more appealing than any fancy dinner she could recall, enhanced by the comfortable conversation and absence of fear. That night, as she lay in bed watching moonlight create patterns on the wall, Delilah allowed herself to acknowledge a growing truth. She was developing feelings for Frank Archer. Not just gratitude, though that remained, but something warmer, more personal. The realization frightened her. She was still a married woman, still legally bound to Benjamin. and Frank's kindness might be nothing more than compassion for someone in need. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, her mind filled with images of his smile, the gentle strength in his hands, the integrity that seemed to define his every action. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Delilah fell asleep with hope for the future warming her heart. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Delilah's life. As her strength returned, she gradually took on small responsibilities around the ranch house. Mrs. Reynolds taught her to make sourdough bread and preserves, skills Delilah had never learned in her previous life as a teacher, and then as Benjamin's wife. Frank was often busy with ranch operations, preparing for the upcoming cattle drive that would take him away for much of the summer. He would leave early each morning and return as the sun was setting, tired but satisfied with the day's work. Despite his busy schedule, he always found time to ask after Delilah's well-being, to bring her wildflowers he'd spotted on the range, or to recommend books from his surprisingly extensive library. As her 4th month of pregnancy progressed into her 5th, Delilah's condition became more visible. The dresses she fashioned from the fabric Frank had purchased accommodated her growing belly, and for the first time, she felt a fluttering movement within the baby making its presence known. The first time it happened, she was sitting on the porch with a book in her lap, enjoying the late spring sunshine. The sensation was so unexpected that she gasped aloud, her hand flying to her abdomen. Frank, who had been repairing a bridle nearby, looked up in alarm. "Are you all right?" "Should I fetch Mrs. Reynolds?" "No," Delilah said, smiling through sudden tears. "The baby moved, I felt it." Frank set aside his work and approached, an expression of wonder crossing his face. "Really, that's wonderful news." Without thinking, Delilah reached for his hand. "Would you like to feel? It might happen again." The moment the words left her mouth, she realized the impropriety of her offer. A flush crept up her neck as she began to withdraw her hand. "I'm sorry, that was—" Frank caught her fingers gently. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Heart racing, Delilah guided his large, calloused hand to the spot where she had felt the movement. They waited in silence, the warm spring air heavy with anticipation. Just when she thought it wouldn't happen again, there was another flutter, stronger this time. Frank's eyes widened, and a smile unlike any she'd seen from him before transformed his face. "That's amazing," he breathed. "A new life." The tenderness in his voice made something shift inside Delilah's heart. For months, Benjamin had referred to the baby as a burden, an inconvenience. Now, watching Frank's awestruck expression as he felt her child move, she glimpsed what fatherhood could and should be. The moment was broken by the arrival of one of the ranch hands, calling for Frank's attention regarding a broken fence. He withdrew his hand reluctantly, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin long after he had gone. That evening at supper, a telegram arrived from the cattle broker in San Francisco. The drive would need to begin earlier than planned, which meant Frank would be leaving in just 3 days. "I'll be gone 6 weeks, perhaps 7, he explained as Mrs. Reynolds served apple pie. "Jeb will manage the ranch in my absence, and Mrs. Reynolds will, of course, be here with you." Delilah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had grown accustomed to Frank's presence, to his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. The thought of weeks without him left an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. "We'll manage just fine," she assured him, "and your business must come first." Mrs. Reynolds interjected practically. "I'll make sure she rests properly, Mr. Archer. By the time you return, she'll be blooming like a summer rose." Frank smiled at the housekeeper's phrasing but looked unconvinced. "I've arranged for Doc Sullivan to visit next week, just to check on your progress. And if anything at all concerns you, Jeb can fetch me from the trail." "I'm sure that won't be necessary," Delilah said, touched by his concern. "The baby and I are doing well, and Mrs. Reynolds is more knowledgeable about these matters than most doctors I've met." The housekeeper preened slightly at the compliment. "Had 6 of my own and helped bring 20 more into the world. Never lost a mother or child yet and don't intend to start now." Frank's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I know you're in good hands, I just—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I wish the timing were different." Something in his tone made Delilah's heart beat faster. She met his gaze across the table, seeing in his blue eyes the same reluctance to part that she herself felt. "The time will pass quickly," she said softly, "and we'll have much to tell you when you return." The next 2 days were filled with preparations for Frank's departure. Delilah found herself creating small comforts for his journey, embroidering handkerchiefs with his initials, baking journey bread that would keep well on the trail. Each gift was offered casually, as though such attention was commonplace rather than expressions of feelings she scarcely understood herself. Frank accepted each token with quiet gratitude, his eyes often lingering on her face as though memorizing her features. On the evening before his departure, he asked if she would walk with him to the small rise behind the house, where a single oak tree stood sentinel over the valley. The sun was setting as they reached the spot, painting the landscape in gold and crimson. Frank spread a blanket on the grass, helping Delilah to sit comfortably before joining her. "I wanted to show you this view before I left," he explained. "It's my favorite place on the ranch." Delilah understood why immediately. From this vantage point, the entire property was visible: the house, barns, and corrals in the foreground, the grazing land stretching toward the creek, and the mountains rising majestically beyond. "It's breathtaking," she said honestly, "like something from a painting." Frank nodded, his gaze sweeping the familiar scene. "When I first won this land, I rode out here and knew I'd found home. After years of wandering, of never belonging anywhere, suddenly I had a place that was mine." Delilah understood that feeling all too well. "I felt that way when I first arrived at your house, safe, like I could breathe again." Frank turned to her, his expression serious. "I want you to know that you always have a place here, Delilah, whatever you decide when the baby comes, whether you go to your sister or—" He hesitated. "Or choose another path." The implication hung between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. Another path, one that might include him. "Frank," she began, her voice scarcely above a whisper, "I'm still married. Whatever my feelings, I know," he interrupted gently. "And I would never ask you to compromise yourself. He reached out, his fingers lightly touching hers on the blanket. "I want you to know that there are options, when the time is right." Delilah looked down at their hands, so close yet not quite joined. "Benjamin will never grant me a divorce, not willingly. To him, that would be admitting failure, losing face." "There are other states with different laws," Frank said carefully. "Places where a woman can claim divorce on grounds of cruelty. With witnesses like Doc Sullivan, with evidence of how he treated you." Hope fluttered in Delilah's chest, fragile as a new leaf in spring. "You've researched this?" Frank nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I wrote to a lawyer in San Francisco, just exploring possibilities." Tears pricked behind Delilah's eyes at this evidence of his thoughtfulness, his commitment to helping her find a way forward. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For saving me that night, for giving us shelter, for—" She swallowed hard. "For showing me that not all men are like Benjamin." Frank's hand finally covered hers, warm and strong. "I should be thanking you," he said quietly. "This house has been just a building for too long. You and Mrs. Reynolds, you've made it a home again." As the sun's final rays gilded the distant peaks, they sat in companionable silence, hands still touching on the blanket between them. No declarations were made, no promises exchanged. Yet Delilah felt something fundamental shift between them, a silent acknowledgement of feelings that had grown despite circumstances, despite propriety, despite everything. When twilight deepened into dusk, Frank helped her to her feet. "We should head back. Early start tomorrow." Delilah nodded, reluctant for the evening to end. As they walked back toward the house, she gathered her courage and spoke the words that had been in her heart for weeks. "I'll miss you, Frank. Please be careful on the trail." He paused, turning to face her in the gathering darkness. For a moment, she thought he might pull her into his arms, might kiss her as she had increasingly dreamed he would. Instead, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. "I'll come back to you, Delilah," he promised softly. "Both of you." The words echoed in her mind long after they had returned to the house, long after she had retired to her room. As she lay in bed, one hand resting on her growing belly, Delilah allowed herself to imagine a future she had thought forever lost, a future with love, with family, with the kind of partnership her parents had shared before illness took them both. It was a dangerous dream, she knew. Benjamin still stood between her and that future. But for the first time, the obstacles didn't seem insurmountable. Frank believed there was a way forward, and his confidence gave her strength. Tomorrow he would leave, and the weeks of separation would test this fragile connection between them. But tonight, Delilah Prescott allowed herself to hope, allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been denying. She was falling in love with Frank Archer. Dawn had barely broken when Delilah awoke to the sounds of activity in the yard. Men's voices, the nickering of horses, the jangle of tack and equipment being loaded. Frank was preparing to leave with his men and the cattle herd. She dressed quickly, choosing one of the dresses she had sewn herself, a soft blue cotton that Mrs. Reynolds said brought out the color in her eyes. Her pregnancy was undeniable now, her belly a proud curve beneath the fabric. Delilah no longer tried to conceal it. Here on the ranch, among people who had shown her nothing but kindness, her condition was celebrated rather than shameful. By the time she made her way downstairs, Mrs. Reynolds was already in the kitchen, preparing a hearty breakfast for the departing men. The housekeeper glanced up as Delilah entered, a knowing smile crossing her face. "They'll be leaving within the hour," she said, nodding toward the door. "Best say your goodbyes while there's time." Delilah felt her cheeks warm but didn't deny the implication in the older woman's words. "I just want to wish them safe travels." "Of course you do, dear." Mrs. Reynolds handed her a pot of coffee and a stack of cups. "Take this out to them. Men always appreciate hot coffee before a long ride." Outside, the ranch yard was a hive of activity. A dozen cowboys moved efficiently among the horses and supply wagons, securing packs and checking equipment. The cattle were already being moved from the near pasture, the distant sound of their lowing carried on the cool morning air. Frank stood near the main barn, deep in conversation with his foreman. He looked different today, not the gentle man who had sat with her beneath the oak tree, but a capable rancher ready for the challenges of the trail. His clothing was practical, sturdy trousers tucked into worn boots, a faded shirt beneath a leather vest, and a bandana at his neck ready to be pulled up against trail dust. He spotted her almost immediately, excusing himself from the conversation to stride toward her. The smile that lit his face made Delilah's heart skip a beat. "You're up early," he observed, taking the coffee pot from her hands. "You should be resting." "I wanted to see you off," she replied simply. "Mrs. Reynolds thought you all might appreciate coffee." The cowboys gathered eagerly as Frank poured the steaming liquid into cups, each man nodding respectfully to Delilah as they accepted the offering. Their manner toward her had changed in recent weeks, she noticed. Initially cautious, perhaps even suspicious of the unknown woman their boss had brought home, they now treated her with a deference that suggested they considered her something more than merely a guest. When all had been served, Frank poured a cup for himself, then walked with Delilah to a quiet corner of the yard. "Everything's prepared for your absence," she assured him. "Mrs. Reynolds and I have planned menus, and Jeb knows which projects need attention while you're gone." Frank smiled at her practical approach. "I'm not worried about the ranch, it's you I'm concerned about." "We'll be fine," Delilah said, her hand automatically moving to her belly. "The baby's strong kicks me half the night to prove it." A shadow of regret crossed Frank's face. "I'll miss seeing how you both progress." 7 weeks isn't so very long, she reminded him, though the time stretched endlessly in her own mind. "And you'll have plenty to occupy your thoughts on the trail." He took a step closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Not enough to keep me from thinking of you, Delilah." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They stood so close now that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that she'd come to associate with him. "Frank, boss." The foreman's call interrupted whatever Delilah had been about to say. "Cattle are moving. Time to ride." Frank closed his eyes briefly, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. When he looked at her again, the emotion was still there but controlled. "I have to go." Delilah nodded, fighting back tears that threatened to embarrass them both. "Be safe." For a moment, he seemed to wage some internal battle. Then, with a quick glance to ensure they weren't closely observed, he bent and pressed his lips to her forehead, a brief, tender gesture that left her skin tingling. "Take care of yourself and the little one," he murmured. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Before she could respond, he was striding away, calling orders to his men as he swung himself into the saddle of his bay gelding. The horse danced beneath him, eager to be moving. Frank turned in the saddle, his eyes finding Delilah one last time. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect and affection, then urged his mount forward. The other cowboys fell in behind him, and soon the yard was empty save for a lingering cloud of dust. Delilah stood watching until the last rider disappeared over the rise, her hand still pressed to the spot on her forehead where Frank's lips had touched. Only when Mrs. Reynolds called her name did she turn back toward the house, carrying with her the memory of that almost kiss and the promise it held. The first week after Frank's departure passed slowly. Delilah filled her days with household tasks, working alongside Mrs. Reynolds to clean, cook, and preserve the early summer produce from the kitchen garden. The physical activity was good for her, the doctor confirmed during his visit, provided she didn't overexert herself. At night, she would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge while her fingers stayed busy with needlework. She was creating a small quilt for the baby, piecing together scraps of fabric in a pattern Mrs. Reynolds called Wandering Star. The repetitive motion was soothing, allowing her mind to wander, often in Frank's direction. Had they reached the high country passes yet? Was he sleeping comfortably? Did the nights feel as empty to him as they did to her? By the second week, a routine had established itself. Mornings were for household work, afternoons for rest and reading from Frank's library, evenings for sewing and conversation with Mrs. Reynolds. The housekeeper proved to be a wealth of information about Frank, sharing stories of his early days at the ranch when he was still learning the cattle business. "Never seen a man so determined to succeed," she remarked one evening as they shelled peas on the porch. "Made plenty of mistakes that first year, but never the same one twice. Learned from everything." "He must have been lonely," Delilah observed, Coming to a new place knowing no one. Mrs. Reynolds nodded. He was, still is in many ways, keeps to himself mostly even now. Respected in town but not one for socializing. She gave Delilah a significant look. Until recently. Delilah focused intently on the peas, avoiding the housekeeper's knowing gaze. He's been kind to me, certainly. Kind, Mrs. Reynolds chuckled. My dear, that man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. I haven't seen him smile so much in 5 years as he has since you arrived. Heat crept up Delilah's neck. I'm a married woman, Mrs. Reynolds. In name only, the older woman countered. That beast in town forfeited any claim to you the moment he raised his hand. Besides, she gestured to Delilah's growing belly. Nature has its own time frame. Some things can't wait for legal niceties. Delilah sighed, setting aside her work. Even if I were free, what could I offer Frank? I bring nothing but complications, a child not his own, a husband who might cause trouble, a reputation that would raise eyebrows in Virginia City. Balderdash, Mrs. Reynolds declared firmly. You bring plenty, kindness, intelligence, a gentle heart that sees the man beneath the rancher. And as for the child, her expression softened. I've watched Mr. Archer when he looks at your belly. That baby's already claimed a place in his heart, same as its mother. Tears pricked behind Delilah's eyes. Do you really think so? I know so. Mrs. Reynolds patted her hand. Just you wait and see. When he comes back from this drive, I predict things will change around here for the better. The conversation gave Delilah much to think about in the days that followed. Could she truly consider a future with Frank, despite the obstacles? And if so, what would that future look like? These questions still occupied her thoughts 3 weeks after Frank's departure, as she walked carefully to the oak tree on the rise. The late June heat made the climb more challenging than it had been before, but Delilah had developed a habit of visiting the spot each evening, drawn by the connection to Frank it represented. She settled on the blanket she'd brought, arranging her skirts around her growing belly. The baby was active today, responding to her movements with kicks and rolls that sometimes took her breath away. Doc Sullivan, during his second visit the day before, had pronounced both mother and child thriving. Strong heartbeat, he'd said, pressing an ear trumpet to her abdomen. And you've gained good weight. Keep doing whatever you're doing, Mrs. Prescott. What she was doing, Delilah reflected as she gazed out over the ranch, was healing not just physically but emotionally. For the first time in years, she felt safe, valued, and hopeful. The constant fear that had been her companion during life with Benjamin had faded, replaced by a growing confidence in herself and her abilities. She was so absorbed in these thoughts that she didn't immediately notice the rider approaching from the eastern trail, not until the horse was halfway up the long drive to the ranch house. Shading her eyes against the setting sun, Delilah tried to identify the visitor. Not Frank, the horse was wrong, a dappled gray rather than his bay. Not one of the ranch hands either, they would approach from the pastures. A chill of apprehension ran through her despite the warm evening. Visitors were rare, and rarely good news. Delilah rose awkwardly, gathering her blanket. She should return to the house, warned Mrs. Reynolds. But before she could begin the descent, the rider changed direction, spurring his horse up the slope toward the oak tree. He had seen her. For one terrible moment, Delilah feared it was Benjamin. Then the rider drew closer and she recognized Doc Sullivan's lean form. Relief flooded her, followed immediately by concern. The doctor wouldn't ride out to the ranch unless something was wrong. Mrs. Prescott, he called as he approached. Glad I found you. Mrs. Reynolds said you might be up here. Is everything all right, doctor? Delilah asked as he dismounted. Has something happened? The doctor removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. News from town. Thought you should know right away." He hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Benjamin Prescott had a confrontation at the saloon last night. Got himself shot." Delilah's hand flew to her throat. "Is he?" "He'll live," Doc Sullivan said grimly. "Bullet took him in the shoulder. Not life-threatening, but he'll be laid up for some time." A complex mix of emotions surged through Delilah: relief that she wasn't responsible for a man's death, however deserving, fear of Benjamin's reaction when he recovered, uncertainty about what this meant for her situation. "Who shot him?" she asked. "Fellow named Matthews, a gambler passing through." Prescott accused him of cheating, pulled a knife. Matthews was faster with his derringer. The doctor's expression was carefully neutral. Town marshal ruled it self-defense. Matthews has already moved on. Delilah sank back onto the blanket, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I see." Doc Sullivan sat beside her, his medical instincts clearly assessing her condition. "This doesn't change your situation substantially, Mrs. Prescott, but it does mean Prescott will be confined to bed for at least a month. Gives you some breathing room. And when he recovers." Delilah's hand moved protectively to her belly. "That's what I wanted to discuss." The doctor reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a folded paper. "I received this telegram yesterday. It's from Frank Archer." Delilah's heart quickened at the mention of Frank's name. "Is he all right?" "Fine, fine. Reached Sacramento ahead of schedule." He handed her the telegram. "Read it yourself." Delilah unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. "Cattle sold, stop returning early, stop, have consulted lawyer regarding D situation, stop promising options, stop home in 10 days, stop Archer 10 days, she whispered, hope and anxiety mingling in her chest. "He's found a lawyer." Doc Sullivan nodded. "Frank's a good man, thinking ahead. And with Prescott injured, this might be the opportunity you need." He hesitated, then added gently, "I've treated Benjamin's wounds, Mrs. Prescott. His temper hasn't improved with injury. If anything, he's more volatile. He's been making threats against you, against the baby." Delilah closed her eyes, one hand pressed against her child as it moved restlessly within her. "He never wanted it. Said he'd rather see me dead than tied down with a brat." "All the more reason to formalize your separation legally, as quickly as possible," the doctor advised. "Frank's lawyer might be able to expedite matters, especially with evidence of Prescott's violence." "What evidence?" Delilah asked bitterly. "My word against his, my medical records, for one," Doc Sullivan replied. "I documented your injuries the night you came to my office, standard practice. And there are witnesses to his public behavior toward you. The bartender at the Silver Dollar, for instance, has seen Prescott drag you from the saloon more than once." Hope flickered in Delilah's chest. "Do you really think it's possible? A divorce?" "With the right lawyer, yes. Especially if Prescott can be persuaded it's in his best interest." The doctor rose, brushing dust from his trousers. "But those are discussions for when Frank returns. For now, rest easy knowing you have time to prepare." As Doc Sullivan mounted his horse to leave, Delilah remained beneath the oak tree, the telegram clutched in her hand. Frank was coming home early. He had consulted a lawyer. He was actively working to create a future where she might be free. For the first time, that future seemed possible, not just a dream, but a potential reality. The thought filled her with a buoyant hope that carried her through the days that followed, as she and Mrs. Reynolds prepared for Frank's return. They cleaned the already immaculate house, baked his favorite apple pie, and made sure his room was perfect. Delilah spent extra time in the garden, gathering the summer roses that had bloomed in his absence to fill vases throughout the house. Each preparation was a small act of love, a way of saying what she wasn't yet free to express in words. The day of his expected return dawned clear and warm. Delilah woke early, too excited to sleep. She chose her prettiest dress, a green cotton that emphasized both her eyes and her growing belly, and arranged her hair with special care. Mrs. Reynolds watched these preparations with knowing eyes but said nothing, only smiling as she went about her morning tasks. By mid-morning, Delilah was too restless to stay indoors. She walked to the corral where Jeb was working with a young colt. "Any sign of them?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The foreman grinned. "Getting anxious, Mrs. Prescott." "Don't worry, boss said they'd be back today, and Mr. Archer keeps his word." "I'm not anxious," Delilah protested, though her frequent glances toward the eastern trail betrayed her. "Just curious about how the drive went." "Sure," Jeb drawled, amusement evident in his tone. "Just like the boss is curious about how you've been. Mentioned you in every telegram he sent. Make sure Mrs. Prescott is comfortable. Check that Mrs. Prescott has everything she needs. Never seen him so concerned about a guest before." Delilah felt her cheeks warm. Had her feelings for Frank been so obvious to everyone but herself? And more importantly, did he truly return them? She was still pondering these questions when a shout went up from one of the hands working near the barn. "Riders coming." Delilah turned quickly, too quickly, making herself momentarily dizzy. When her vision cleared, she saw them. A line of dusty cowboys riding toward the ranch, tired but triumphant after their journey. And at their head, sitting tall in the saddle despite weeks on the trail, was Frank. Even at a distance, she could see he had changed during his absence. His face was leaner, tanned dark by the sun, his clothing trail worn. But as he drew closer, it was his expression that captured her attention, the way his eyes searched the ranch yard until they found her, the smile that transformed his weathered features when they did. Delilah stood motionless, one hand shading her eyes, the other resting on her belly where the baby had begun an excited dance, as if sensing her emotions. Frank rode directly to her, swinging down from his saddle with a grace that belied his weeks in the saddle. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, drinking in the changes that 5 weeks had wrought. Frank's gaze traveled over her face, then downward to where her pregnancy had become even more pronounced in his absence. "You're more beautiful than I remembered," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion and trail dust. Tears pricked behind Delilah's eyes. "You're earlier than your telegram said. Couldn't stay away another day." His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek. "I missed you, Delilah. Both of you." Before she could respond, the baby kicked forcefully, directly beneath Frank's hand. His eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with delight. "Someone saying hello," Delilah laughed, covering his hand with her own and moving it to feel the movement better. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Reynolds calling from the porch, announcing that hot food awaited the returning men. Frank reluctantly withdrew his hand, though his eyes remained on Delilah's face. "Tonight," he said quietly. "Once things settle down, we need to talk." Delilah nodded, her heart fluttering with anticipation and hope. Tonight. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity. The cowboys celebrated their successful drive with hearty food and exaggerated tales of their adventures on the trail. Frank moved among his men, congratulating them on a job well done, before retreating to his office to handle the financial aspects of the cattle sale. Delilah kept busy helping Mrs. Reynolds serve the hungry men, but her awareness of Frank's presence in the house was constant. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the room, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. As evening approached, the cowboys departed for their bunks, tired from the journey and full of Mrs. Reynolds' cooking. The house grew quiet, The only sounds the clink of dishes as the housekeeper cleaned the kitchen and the distant lowing of cattle in the pastures. Frank found Delilah on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. He had bathed and changed into fresh clothing, his dark hair still damp at the temples. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. "Up to the oak tree. I've thought about that spot often while I was away." Delilah nodded, accepting his offered arm. They climbed the gentle slope in comfortable silence, the only sound the whisper of grass beneath their feet and the evening calls of birds returning to their nests. The oak tree stood silhouetted against the sunset, its massive branches creating a canopy over the spot where they had sat the night before his departure. Frank spread his coat on the ground, helping Delilah to sit before settling beside her. "I spoke with Doc Sullivan in town before coming home," he began. "He told me about Prescott's injury." "Yes," Delilah acknowledged. "It seems I have a reprieve at least for a few weeks." Frank's expression grew serious. "More than a reprieve, I hope." He reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing several folded papers. "I met with a lawyer in Sacramento, one who specializes in difficult divorce cases. He believes you have strong grounds for dissolution of marriage under California law." Delilah's heart quickened. "California? But we were married in Nevada." "California's laws regarding divorce are more favorable to women in your situation," Frank explained. "And since you lived in Sacramento before your marriage and have family there now, the lawyer believes a judge would allow the case to proceed there." "On what grounds?" Delilah asked, hardly daring to hope. "Extreme cruelty," Frank said, his jaw tightening. "With Doc Sullivan's testimony about your injuries the night you fled, plus affidavits from witnesses to Prescott's public behavior toward you, the case is strong." Delilah stared at the papers in his hand, documents that could represent her freedom, her future. "And Benjamin, he'll fight it." "Possibly," Frank acknowledged, "but the lawyer believes he can be persuaded to accept, especially if presented correctly." A slight smile touched his lips. "Few men want to publicly defend themselves against charges of beating a pregnant woman." "When could this happen?" "Soon. The lawyer is prepared to file immediately if you agree." Frank hesitated, then reached for her hand. "Delilah, I know this is your decision. You may choose to return to your sister to build a new life elsewhere, but I want you to know," he took a deep breath, "I want you to stay here with me." Delilah's eyes filled with tears. "Frank, let me finish," he said gently. "These weeks without you showed me what I already knew in my heart. I love you, Delilah. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination to protect your child. I love the way you've brought life back to this house, the way you see beauty in things I'd stopped noticing." A tear slipped down Delilah's cheek. "I'm carrying another man's child." Frank's hand moved to her belly where the baby shifted beneath his touch. "This child is innocent of its father's sins. I already love it, Delilah, because it's part of you." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "If you'll have me, I want to be a father to this baby. I want to give it my name, my protection, my love." Delilah covered his hand with hers, overwhelmed by emotion. "I never thought I could feel this way again. After Benjamin, I believed that part of me was dead, the part that could trust, that could love." She drew a shaky breath. "But you brought it back to life, Frank. You showed me what a good man truly is." "Is that a yes?" he asked, hope illuminating his features. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it. To the divorce, to staying here, to building a life together." Frank's smile was radiant as he gathered her gently into his arms. "I've wanted to do this for so long," he murmured, before lowering his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they finally parted, the sun had set completely, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Frank helped Delilah to her feet, keeping her hand firmly in his as they walked back to the house. "Tomorrow I'll send a telegram to the lawyer," he said. "The sooner we begin the process, the sooner you'll be free." Delilah squeezed his fingers. "And the sooner we can begin our life together." The weeks that followed were filled with legal correspondence as the Sacramento lawyer set the divorce proceedings in motion. To their surprise, Benjamin Prescott offered little resistance once presented with the evidence against him and the potential public embarrassment of a contested divorce. His injury had left him dependent on liquor for pain relief, further weakening his position. By late summer, as Delilah entered her 8th month of pregnancy, word came that the divorce had been granted. She was legally free, though convention dictated a waiting period before remarriage. Frank respected these conventions in public, maintaining separate bedrooms and ensuring Mrs. Reynolds' continued presence as chaperone. But in private, they planned their future together: the nursery for the baby, improvements to the ranch house, the small ceremony they would have once sufficient time had passed. As September gave way to October, Delilah's time drew near. The baby had dropped lower, making breathing easier but walking more challenging. Frank hovered anxiously, insisting she rest more, bringing her books from town, reading to her in the evenings as they sat before the fire. One such evening, as he read from Tennyson's poems, Delilah felt the first unmistakable contraction, a tightening across her abdomen that took her breath away. "Frank," she interrupted his reading, "I think it's time." His book dropped to the floor as he leapt to his feet. "Now, are you certain?" "I should fetch Mrs. Reynolds and send for the doctor." Delilah couldn't help laughing despite her discomfort. The confident rancher who commanded cowboys and cattle with ease had been replaced by a nervous, expectant father. "Yes to all of that," she assured him. "But don't panic. First babies often take their time." This one, however, proved eager to enter the world. By midnight, Delilah's labor had progressed rapidly, with Mrs. Reynolds directing proceedings like a general commanding troops. Frank had been banished to the hallway, where he paced restlessly, flinching at each cry from within. Doc Sullivan arrived just in time, hurrying into the bedroom with his medical bag. "Sounds like someone's not waiting for formalities," he observed, washing his hands quickly. 2 hours later, as the first light of dawn crept through the bedroom windows, a lusty cry announced the arrival of Daniel Francis Prescott, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. Mrs. Reynolds cleaned and swaddled the infant while Doc Sullivan attended to Delilah. Once both were pronounced healthy, the housekeeper opened the bedroom door to admit Frank, whose face was pale with worry and lack of sleep. "Come meet your son," Delilah said softly, cradling the tiny bundle in her arms. Frank approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. When Delilah placed the baby in his arms, his expression transformed from anxiety to wonder. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's tiny fingers. "Just like his mother." Mrs. Reynolds and the doctor discreetly withdrew, leaving the new family alone. Frank perched carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding the baby as though he were made of spun glass. "I was thinking," Delilah said, watching them together, "about his name." "I know it's traditional for firstborn sons to carry their father's name, but his name is perfect as it is," Frank interrupted gently. "Daniel Francis. A good, strong name." He smiled down at the infant. "Though I hope one day soon he'll carry my last name as well." "I'd like that," Delilah murmured, reaching out to touch Frank's cheek. "All of us with the same name. A real family." Frank leaned forward, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby, and pressed a tender kiss to her lips. "We already are a family, Delilah. The papers just make it official." 3 months later, on a crisp January day in 1876, Delilah Prescott became Delilah Archer in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Daniel, growing stronger each day, was held by Mrs. Reynolds, who wept unashamedly as the couple exchanged vows beneath the oak tree on the rise. Doc Sullivan stood as witness, along with Jeb, and the ranch hands who had come to regard Delilah with protective affection over the months. Even Delilah's sister had traveled from Sacramento for the occasion, bringing news that Benjamin Prescott had left Virginia City, moving north to the newer mining operations in Montana Territory. As Frank slipped a gold band onto her finger, specially ordered from San Francisco, Delilah felt the final shadows of her past life fade away. The frightened, bleeding woman who had collapsed in a saloon doorway during a storm seemed like someone from a distant dream, hardly connected to the confident, loved woman she had become. That evening, after the celebrations had ended and their guests had departed, Frank and Delilah stood on the porch of their home, watching stars appear in the winter sky. Daniel slept peacefully in the nursery upstairs, watched over by Mrs. Reynolds, who had insisted on giving the newlyweds this time alone. "Happy, Mrs. Archer?" Frank asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Delilah leaned into his embrace, savoring the rightness of being there, of belonging. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." Frank turned her gently to face him, his expression solemn despite the joy of the day. "I want to make you a promise, Delilah, one that matters more than the vows we spoke today." "What's that?" she asked, reaching up to touch his face. "That you will never again know fear in your own home. That Daniel will grow up seeing how a man should treat those he loves with respect, with gentleness, with unwavering devotion." His voice deepened with emotion. "That whatever storms life brings, we'll weather them together." Tears of happiness filled Delilah's eyes as she rose on tiptoe to kiss him. "I believe you, Frank Archer. With all my heart, I believe you." As snow began to fall softly around them, Frank led his bride inside to the warmth of their home, the home they had created together, the sanctuary they would share with their growing family in the years ahead. Spring came early to Nevada that year, bringing with it the renewal of the land and the celebration of Daniel's first birthday. The ranch flourished under Frank's management, allowing them to add a new wing to the house and hire additional hands for the expanding herd. On a warm April evening, as they sat beneath their oak tree watching Daniel take his first tentative steps across the grass, Delilah shared her suspicion that their family would soon be growing again. Frank's joy at this news was boundless, his protective instincts immediately doubling as he insisted on carrying both his wife and son back down the hill to the house. 8 months later, Elizabeth Catherine Archer entered the world a blue-eyed daughter who would grow to have her father's quiet strength and her mother's gentle heart. And 2 years after that, twins James and William completed their family, bringing noise and laughter to every corner of the ranch house. Virginia City changed with the passing years, as minds played out and new opportunities arose elsewhere. But the Archer Ranch remained, a testament to hard work, perseverance, and the healing power of love. Sometimes, on stormy nights when thunder rolled across the valley, Delilah would remember that desperate ride through the rain, bleeding and terrified, in the arms of a stranger who had become her salvation. She would watch Frank reading to their children or tucking them into bed, and marvel at the journey that had brought her from darkness into such abundant light. And Frank, catching her reflective gaze, would cross the room to take her in his arms, wordlessly acknowledging all they had overcome to build this life together. No matter how many years passed, he never took for granted the gift of her love or the family they had created from the ashes of her previous life. "Thank you for saving me that night," she whispered once, as they stood on the porch watching a summer storm roll across the valley. Frank smiled, drawing her closer against the coming rain. "We saved each other, Delilah, and we always will."